The bullets that ended Big Paul Castellano's life last night may very well have been a payoff for getting into such trouble with the feds.
December 16th, 1985. Sparks Steakhouse, Manhattan. Paul Castellano steps out of the passenger side of his Lincoln sedan in front of Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, and within seconds, three men in beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats open fire. Castellano is hit 6 times and collapses beside a lamppost while his driver and newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bellotti, is shot 4 times as he exits the car, falling into the street. Across the street, John Gotti and Sammy Gravano watch from behind the tinted windows of their parked car, and after confirming both men are gone, they slowly drive past the bodies before heading back to Brooklyn. The hit violates the most sacred rule in the American Mafia. You never eliminate a sitting boss without permission from the commission, and it changes organized crime forever. If you want to know why John Gotti risked everything to break that rule and what made Paul Castellano's murder inevitable, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. To understand why John Gotti ordered the elimination of Paul Castellano, you need to understand who Castellano was and how he got to the top of the most powerful crime family in America. Constantino Paul Castellano was born on June 26, 1915, in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, New York. His father, Giuseppe Castellano, was a butcher and an early member of the Mangano crime family, the predecessor to what would become the Gambino family. His mother, Concetta, raised Paul and his siblings in a working-class neighborhood where organized crime wasn't hidden. It was woven into daily life. Paul dropped out of school in the 8th grade to work in his father's butcher shop and help collect numbers game receipts. He learned more about business and loyalty from his father's rackets than he ever would have learned in a classroom. In 1937, Paul Castellano married his childhood sweetheart, Nina Mano. They would have 3 sons and a daughter. By the 1940s, Castellano was a made member of the Mangano family. When Albert Anastasia took over after Vince Mangano's disappearance in 1951, Castellano was promoted to capo. And when Anastasia was shot and eliminated in a barbershop on October 25, 1957, Carlo Gambino took over and renamed the organization the Gambino Crime Family. On November 14, 1957, just weeks after Anastasia's elimination, law enforcement raided a meeting of high-ranking mobsters in Appalachian, New York. Paul Castellano was one of 61 men arrested at what became known as the Appalachian Meeting. He refused to answer grand jury questions about the gathering and was convicted of contempt of court. He spent a year in prison. In 1960, he was sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy to withhold information, but the conviction was reversed on appeal later that year. These legal troubles only strengthened his position within the family. He'd proven again that he wouldn't cooperate with authorities. Carlo Gambino recognized that Castellano had talents that went beyond traditional mob activities. While other mobsters were content running gambling operations and loan sharking, Castellano understood legitimate business. He took control of Dial Poultry, a meat distribution company that supplied over 300 butcher shops in New York City. He used intimidation and mob connections to force supermarkets like Key Food and Waldbaum's to buy from his company. His son Philip became president of Scaramix Concrete Corporation, which held a near monopoly on concrete supply in Staten Island. Castellano also managed Gambino interests in the Concrete Club, a consortium of mob families that controlled all major construction projects in New York. No one could pour concrete for a project worth more than $2 million without approval from the Concrete Club. And Castellano supervised Gambino control of Teamsters Union Local 282, which provided workers for every major building project in New York and Long Island. This white-collar approach to organized crime made Castellano incredibly wealthy. By the early 1980s, his net worth was estimated at $20 million. He built a massive mansion on Todd Hill in Staten Island, a 17-room estate that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a mobster's home. He lived like a CEO, wore expensive suits, avoided the streets, operated from his mansion, conducting business over the phone and through intermediaries. And this approach created a problem. Many members of the Gambino family, especially the younger street-level capos and soldiers, resented him. When Carlo Gambino passed away from natural causes on October 15, 1976, he named Paul Castellano as his successor. The decision shocked most of the family. Everyone expected Aniello Neil Della Croce, Gambino's underboss, to take over. Della Croce was a traditional mobster, tough, respected, connected to the street crews. He'd been with Gambino since the beginning. But Gambino chose Castellano because he believed the family's future was in white-collar crime, not street-level rackets. To ease the transition, Gambino made Castellano promise to keep Della Croce as underboss, and Castellano honored that promise. Della Croce remained underboss and retained control over the street crews and traditional mob activities, while Castellano focused on construction, unions, and legitimate businesses. But the resentment never went away. John Gotti, a capo who ran a crew out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, was one of Della Croce's most loyal supporters. Gotti was everything Castellano wasn't. Street smart, charismatic, comfortable with violence. He'd grown up in the mob, pulling hijackings and running gambling operations. He believed in the old ways: respect, loyalty, taking care of your crew. And he thought Castellano was out of touch. A boss who lived in a mansion on Staten Island and never visited the neighborhoods where his soldiers worked. A boss who demanded 15% tribute instead of the traditional 10%. A boss who banned drug dealing, even though drug money was the most profitable racket available. And that drug ban created the crisis that would eventually lead to Castellano's elimination. In 1981, the FBI obtained a warrant to wiretap the home of Angelo Ruggiero, a Gambino soldier who was John Gotti's childhood friend and one of his closest associates. The FBI was investigating loan sharking and illegal gambling, but what they heard on those tapes was far more damaging. Angelo Ruggiero, who'd earned the nickname Quack Quack because he never stopped talking, discussed heroin deals in detail. He talked about drug trafficking with Gotti's brother Gene and another Gambino associate named John Carnaglia. And he insulted Paul Castellano repeatedly, calling him greedy and out of touch. In 1983, Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti were indicted on federal narcotics charges based on the wiretap evidence. This created a massive problem for the Gambino family. Castellano had a strict policy against drug dealing. He believed it brought too much law enforcement attention. And now he had proof that some of his most trusted capos were violating that rule. When the indictment was revealed, defense attorneys received portions of the wiretap transcripts, and Castellano learned that the tapes included conversations about him. He demanded that Aniello Della Croce hand over the tapes so he could hear exactly what had been said. But Della Croce refused. He stalled, made excuses, told Castellano the tapes contained personal matters that would embarrass people. The truth was that Della Croce was protecting Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti's crew. If Castellano heard those tapes, he'd know the full extent of their drug operations. And according to mob rules, anyone dealing drugs could be eliminated. Della Croce kept stalling until December 2, 1985, when he passed away from lung cancer. His death removed the only protection Gotti's crew had from Castellano's wrath. And then Castellano made a decision that sealed his fate. He didn't attend Aniello Della Croce's wake. Castellano was facing multiple federal indictments, including the commission case, where he and other mob bosses were charged with racketeering. His lawyers advised him to stay away from mob funerals because being photographed at a gathering of known criminals wouldn't help his legal situation. From Castellano's perspective, it was a practical decision. But to John Gotti and Della Croce's loyalists, it was the ultimate insult. Della Croce had been underboss for nearly a decade. He'd been loyal to the family for his entire life, and Castellano couldn't even show up to pay respects. 2 days after Della Croce's wake, Castellano announced that Thomas Bellotti, his personal bodyguard and driver, would be the new underboss. This decision enraged senior members of the family. Bellotti was loyal to Castellano, but he had a reputation as a brutal enforcer with no diplomatic skills. He wasn't respected by the capos. He hadn't earned the position through years of service. He got it because he was Castellano's friend. And to John Gotti, this promotion meant that Castellano was consolidating power and preparing to move against anyone involved in drug dealing. Gotti believed he had no choice. If he waited, Castellano would demand the wiretap tapes and discover that Gotti's entire crew, Angelo Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, John Carneglia, had been dealing heroin for years. Castellano would order them all eliminated, and Gotti might be next. So Gotti made a decision. He would eliminate Castellano first. But there was a problem. According to Mafia rules, you can't eliminate a sitting boss without permission from the Commission, the ruling body that governed all 5 New York families. The Commission existed to prevent exactly this kind of internal conflict. If you had a problem with your boss, you brought it to the Commission. They investigated, they voted, and they authorized the hit. That's how it was supposed to work. But Gotti didn't ask for permission. He knew the Commission wouldn't approve it. Paul Castellano was the boss of the largest and most powerful family in New York. He controlled billions of dollars in construction rackets. He had connections to politicians, judges, and union leaders. The other bosses on the Commission, especially Vincent Chin Gigante of the Genovese family, would never authorize his elimination just because some street-level capos were unhappy. So Gotti decided to break the rule. He would eliminate Castellano without permission and deal with the consequences later. Gotti assembled a team. Sammy "the Bull" Gravano, a respected Gambino capo, agreed to support the hit after concluding that the family was at risk of splintering if Castellano remained in power. Frank DeCicco, one of Castellano's most trusted capos and a longtime protege, secretly provided inside information about Castellano's schedule. According to Gravano's later testimony, the hit team consisted of 11 men, 4 shooters, several backups, getaway drivers. All of them were Gambino family members. Most were made men. Frank DeCicco told Gotti that Castellano had agreed to a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985, to discuss the growing tensions within the family. Castellano was supposed to meet with DeCicco and other capos to smooth things over after skipping Della Croce's funeral. It was the perfect setup. The shooters wore beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats to blend in with holiday shoppers in Midtown Manhattan. They positioned themselves near the entrance of Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. Gotti and Gravano parked across the street with a walkie-talkie, watching and waiting. At 5:16 p.m., Castellano's Lincoln pulled up in front of the restaurant. Bellotti was driving. When Gotti confirmed both targets were in the car, he gave the order over the walkie-talkie. As Castellano stepped out of the passenger side, the 3 gunmen ran toward him and opened fire. Castellano was hit 6 times. He collapsed beside a lamppost on the sidewalk. Bellotti tried to exit the driver's side and defend himself, but he was shot 4 times from behind. He fell into the street about 2 yards from the curb. The entire hit took less than 15 seconds. Hundreds of people were in the area, including on-duty and off-duty police officers. But it happened so fast that no one could react. The gunmen disappeared into the holiday crowds. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano slowly drove past the scene to confirm both men were gone. Then they headed back to Brooklyn. 2 weeks later, a meeting of Gambino capos in Manhattan elected Gotti as the new boss of the family. He'd eliminated his boss in broad daylight in Midtown Manhattan without permission from the commission, and he'd gotten away with it. But the consequences of that decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. The other families on the commission were furious. Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family, considered the unauthorized hit a violation of everything the commission stood for. But he couldn't move against Gotti immediately. The Gambino family was too powerful, and Gotti had support from his own people. So Gigante waited and watched, and eventually the federal government did what the commission couldn't. In 1992, Sammy Gravano flipped and became a government witness. He testified that Gotti had ordered the elimination of Paul Castellano. On April 3, 1992, Gotti was convicted of racketeering and the Castellano hit. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He passed away in prison on June 10, 2002. So why did John Gotti break the Mafia's most sacred rule to eliminate Paul Castellano? The answer is survival. Gotti believed that if he waited for Castellano to hear the wiretap tapes, his entire crew would be eliminated. Angelo Ruggiero would be gone. Gene Gotti would be gone. John Carneglia would be gone. And Gotti himself might be next. The tapes proved they'd been dealing heroin, which violated Castellano's ban, and in the world Gotti lived in, that violation carried a death sentence. So Gotti made a choice. He'd rather eliminate his boss and face the wrath of the commission than sit back and wait to be eliminated himself. But there were other reasons too. Gotti genuinely believed Castellano was a bad boss, out of touch, greedy, more concerned with his mansion and his white-collar rackets than with the soldiers who worked the streets. Castellano's refusal to attend Della Croce's wake was the final insult. To Gotti, it proved that Castellano had no respect for the men who'd built the family. And when Castellano promoted Thomas Bellotti to underboss, passing over more qualified and respected capos, it confirmed Gotti's belief that Castellano cared more about loyalty to himself than the health of the family. There was also ambition. Gotti wanted to be boss. He'd spent his entire life working his way up through the ranks. He was charismatic, popular with the soldiers, and he believed he could run the family better than Castellano ever did. When the opportunity came to eliminate Castellano and take power, Gotti took it, even knowing it would violate the commission's rules, even knowing it would make enemies. He believed he could handle the consequences. And for a while, it worked. Gotti became the most famous mob boss in America. The Dapper Don, the Teflon Don. He walked out of courtroom after courtroom, acquitted on charges that should have put him away for life. The media loved him. The public was fascinated by him. He wore expensive suits, held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, acted like he was untouchable. But his refusal to hide in the shadows drew relentless attention from law enforcement. The FBI watched his every move, built cases, turned witnesses, and eventually, Sammy Gravano's testimony brought him down. Paul Castellano's elimination outside Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985, marked the end of one era of the American Mafia and the beginning of another. Castellano represented the transition from street-level crime to white-collar rackets. He ran the Gambino family like a corporation, focused on construction, unions, and legitimate businesses, avoided violence when possible, lived quietly in his mansion, and in doing so, he alienated the street crews who'd built the family's power. John Gotti represented a return to the old ways. Loyalty, respect, taking care of your crew, being visible, being feared. But Gotti's style also made him a target. His public persona and refusal to operate quietly gave prosecutors everything they needed to build cases against him. The hit itself was unprecedented. A sitting boss eliminated in Midtown Manhattan during rush hour in front of hundreds of witnesses. It was brazen, reckless, and it sent a message that the old rules didn't matter anymore. The commission was supposed to prevent this kind of internal warfare, But Gotti proved that if you had enough support within your own family, you could break the rules and survive, at least for a while. The consequences rippled through the entire mafia. Vincent Gigante and the other commission bosses never trusted Gotti. They saw him as a cowboy who'd violated sacred traditions. And while they couldn't move against him openly, they cooperated with federal prosecutors in ways that eventually led to his downfall. The publicity surrounding Castellano's elimination also brought unprecedented law enforcement attention to organized crime. The FBI intensified surveillance. Prosecutors built RICO cases, and informants like Sammy Gravano started flipping, providing testimony that destroyed entire families. 40 years later, Sparks Steakhouse still stands on East 46th Street. Tourists dine where Paul Castellano fell. There's no plaque, no memorial, just cold concrete and the memory of a hit that changed everything. The Gambino family survived, but it never recovered the power it had under Castellano. And John Gotti, the man who broke the mafia's most sacred rule to seize control, spent the last decade of his life in a federal prison, watching the empire he'd fought so hard to control crumble around him. Why did John Gotti break the most sacred rule in the mafia to eliminate Paul Castellano? Because he believed his survival depended on it. Because he resented a boss who lived in a mansion while his soldiers worked the streets. Because Castellano skipped Delacroce's funeral and promoted an unqualified bodyguard to underboss. And because Gotti wanted power and was willing to risk everything to take it. On December 16, 1985, at 5:16 p.m., those calculations led 3 men in trench coats to open fire on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan. And the American Mafia was never the same.